Hi everyone, this is Matthew Sprague, and this is my final presentation on Spring.io and Wildfly. Today I will be going over things that I learned while implementing this project, Maven Development, the login for a database connection, structure for your JSON data returns. We'll look at a poorly designed endpoint, and then we'll look at a nicely designed endpoint, and then I have some closing thoughts. So things I have learned during the course of this project. Configuring a server, you're almost never done. You think that you have everything set up how you want it, but you change one thing in the application server and then you realize that it's not going to work with what you initially thought you would set up in your application server. Um, it's basically it's an ongoing process. You're never really going to be finished configuring your server. Even when you think you're finished, you're not finished. Next thing, Maven is a wonderful tool. Uh, but there are a few caveats. You have to really take the time to learn it properly. There are a few catches, and we'll go over those in the next slide when we go over the Maven stuff. Source control, whether it be SVN or Git, which is what I've been using, can benefit every developer, not just developers working on a team. It can even benefit lone developers, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. Security, it's not just one thing. Security is baked into everything you do as a developer. And if you, as the application developer, aren't thinking about security, your application is not going to be secure. If your server developer is not thinking about security, your server is not going to be secure. And if you basically have one hole in your security setup, you are just vulnerable. You might as well, if you have one weak point, everybody might as well just throw security out the window because it doesn't really matter. All it takes is somebody who doesn't really care about security, and that can really that can completely be your downfall. So security, it's not just one thing; it's everything. Java is a great tool for developing application logic. In my job, I write SQL queries and write stored procedures mostly on a SQL Server database. And what I can tell you from doing primarily just that for the past 3 years is that SQL is not a programming language, and there are some things that it's just not good for, like loops, for example. If you can use a programming language to do your application logic, you're going to be way better off, and it's just so much better for so much faster, so much better in every single way. Finally, the last thing I learned is that everyone should configure a server, and the reason I say that is because I really thought that I would have an easy time setting this up because I've worked with servers for so long. I mean, I work with database servers, I work with web servers, I work with application servers, but I had never set one up before. And when you set one up, you're really getting into some fine details that you just got to do it. Everyone should be doing this. Everyone should at least configure one server on their own because it's so beneficial. Okay, Maven Development. If you don't know what Maven is a tool that will allow you to use Java libraries without having to think too much about the Java libraries. So when I first started Java development, there was no Maven, and your only option was to go online and find the library that you were looking for, download the jar file, and maintain it manually inside of your project. So Maven does all of that for you. Basically what you do is you set up a config file. It's called pom.xml. And you put all your dependencies in that file. Now, you can specify. So say there's a library where you want to use a very specific version. You can specify the version that you want to use, and Maven will only maintain that copy, that version. You don't have to specify a version now, because if, and let me try to explain this. You can specify versions for certain jar files and not specify versions for others. So essentially what you would be doing in that case is, if you have one specific jar file that you know you need to use a particular version, you specify it. If you have another one where you say, oh, well, I kind of want the latest and greatest, then you just don't specify a version for that. And it's really a great tool, and it can save you a ton of time. It really can. I put this note, this be careful note in here, because if you are using a VPN or proxy with your Maven, specifically for if you have a company intranet, and you have a proxy set up for accessing outside resources. Okay, don't need that right now. Then you may have some additional setup work, because there are times if your proxy server doesn't play nicely with your firewall, there could be times where certain jar files are getting updated, but then other ones aren't, because they can't reach the network to get those updates and download those updates for you. So I just want to make that note in there, that if you're starting to work with Maven, just be cautious when using a VPN or proxy, that those could cause a hazard. Okay, this is the Maven pom.xml. Well, it's not the whole thing, but it's a few dependencies inside of that file. So as you can see here, we are looking at the dependencies for Spring Boot. So this is going to be the files that you're going to need if you are developing an application in Spring. And you notice we have the Tomcat server in here, even though I'm using Wildfly. That's why this says scope provided, is because it kind of is a kind of an ignore that library sort of thing, because we are not actually using Tomcat. We're using Wildfly, but the Spring kit comes with Tomcat by default. So you may have to do as I have done here and ignore that dependency. And then here are two more dependencies that we've added: javax.servlet, and you see we specify version 2.5 because I do not want to have any version changes on my servlet libraries. And I'm using SQL Server for my database, so I've included that dependency here. And so what this will do is it will enable me to run through my entire project without having to maintain a single jar file for libraries. I don't even have to worry about it, because Maven's going to do it for me. And anytime I want to update those libraries, it's as simple as right-clicking on the project and saying Maven update, and everything will update. So here we go. We are creating a login for our database. That's kind of the first step in getting an application ready to run queries on a database. Obviously, I've given data reader and data writer roles for this connection. Principal, least privilege, we only want to give the roles that we are going to need for this login. And so this login is essentially any user who is executing your application on that database. Okay, so the structure for our Spring data return. This is just a Java class. It's pretty simple. It needs to mirror exactly the result set that you are going to return. I guess I shouldn't say result set. It needs to mirror the JSON data structure that you're going to return. So if I have these 4 rows, I'm going to make a class with these 4 instance variables, and I'll show you how we're going to use that in 1 second. And then just note, you also are going to have getters and setters, but they don't fit on the slide, so I just figured we could imagine that they are there. Good. Okay, so this is my poorly secured endpoint. These annotations that you see, the @rest controller, that tells Spring that this class is a REST controller class, which means that we are going to have our request mappings inside of this class. So basically, okay, let me explain something else. The auto-wired in here, that is where we are getting our JDBC template from the application.properties. And that's going to be the object that we're going to use to run our query. So you see the next annotation, the request mapping. That is going to be the endpoint URL that we are going to give to the front-end developer so that he can consume your API. And this one is poorly designed for the reason that you can see in the SQL in the where statement, where username equals and just the user that was passed in from the internet. So we didn't do anything to parameterize these inputs. We just took them straight from wherever they came from and slammed them into our SQL query. Not good, as we shall see, because when I go to my localhost, that endpoint, the poorly secured endpoint, and I give it the user parameter equal to A in single ticks, or 1 is equal to 1. So essentially, let me go back. What your SQL is now saying is where select star from database fdw dbo.users where username equals A or 1 equals 1. And that's what you get. You just get a dump of that whole table. So the 5 users that I have built in there, they're all printed out to the screen. Now, let's take a look at a nicely secured endpoint. So the only difference between these two is the where statement has a question mark. And then the Spring method on the JDBC object query takes the SQL as it did before. It's exactly the same as before, but the only difference is we are putting our parameters inside of that new object. And this is just so if you needed more than one parameter, you would just make sure that you put them into your object in the order that you use them in the query. So if you had, select star from users where username equals question mark and, whatever some other column is equal to another question mark, you would need user to come first, and then the second thing would come next. So it's as simple as that. And what you get when you parameterize your input, and there's other ways to parameterize. I mean, with Spring, there's literally 100 ways to do anything. This is far from the only way of doing it. But the principle is the same, is parameterizing your inputs. And so when we do this, we do not get SQL injection. So you see in the URL here, I'm going to the exact same URL, my localhost, and I'm giving it exactly the same user. So user equals A or 1 equals 1, but you see we get nothing. And the whole reason that you get nothing in this case is because it is now looking at user as a whole. It's looking at that whole value that was passed in, and it's not separating those ticks and allowing the SQL injection to take place. So very simple change for adding much better security. So, closing thoughts. As you can see, Spring provides you the tools, but it is always up to the developer to make it secure. Even using a tool like Spring, you can build an application that is susceptible, that can be SQL injected. Okay. Second thing. Really, guys, really, if you haven't used something like Git or possibly SVN as well, but I would strongly recommend Git just because it's my personal preference, and I think I think it offers a lot more tools for development for like built into your development environment, so your IDE. Git is just, it has a lot more features than SVN in my opinion. Maven, it's going to save you time. It really is. Even if your project is just something simple, but you have to add a calendar. If you have to add some kind of functionality from an outside library, Maven just makes your life so much easier. Finally, security, it needs to be the primary focus at every stage of applications development, as well as server configuration. Because if it's not, and you have one flaw in your architecture, you're going to be impervious to attacks. So those are my closing thoughts. And I have one more thing I'm excited to share with you guys, and that is I am finished with my degree at the end of this semester. I've been at it for 2.5 years. I did 4 courses for each of my first 2 years, and then this is it. I'm doing the last 2 courses this semester, and I'm going to be graduating in April 2018 commencement. So I just wanted to tell you guys that, and I wanted to say also to anyone else who may be graduating at the end of the semester, congratulations to you. And if you're not graduating at the end of the semester, I just want to say keep it up, because it is so worth it in the end. So, all right, thanks.